So this is the session on positive peace application focused on low levels of corruption. I'm Alberto Díaz-Cayeros at the Center for Latin American Studies here at Stanford. I will not read the bios of our panelists. I will just introduce them in order. And what I want to highlight is just something that you might not be aware, because David did not really have time to feed us into all the dimensions of both the negative piece and the positive piece, but corruption is one of the variables that really loads very highly in terms of a correlation with many of the dimensions of the peace index. And in some ways, I think it's still pretty much of a black box. We don't really understand why these huge correlations are there, and I hope that this panel can shed some light on why it is. So we'll start with Francis Fukuyama, who is a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute and director of the center I'm affiliated with, the Center for Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law. And we'll try to keep the interventions 10 minutes each, and then try to open up for enough discussion. So thank you, Frank.
Okay, thank you, Alberto. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm actually not going to spend a lot of time about why corruption is bad and actually the empirical data about how it correlates with all these other bad things. It's true, but I actually think that it's better to get to actually what practical steps have been taken and can be taken to reduce levels of corruption. Francesca Roccanantini at the World Bank and I actually just co-authored an article. So it was last year, 20 years since James Wolfenson gave this widely remarked cancer of corruption speech. It was really the first time where the World Bank started to take the issue of corruption seriously and move it to the front of its agenda. And in that 20 years, not just the World Bank, but a lot of other development agencies, USAID and DFID and a lot of others, have made anti-corruption and good governance kind of the centerpieces of their development strategies. So again, I'm not going to go into the theory about why. I mean, I actually think that this is the right agenda, because I think that poverty really correlates with bad governance, very highly. And so if you can solve this problem, you're going to solve a lot of other problems as well. But the article that we've written, so it's an attempt to just look empirically at what the success of different approaches to anti-corruption have been. And overall, it's actually a very depressing article because despite billions of dollars, I mean literally billions of dollars poured into good governance, anti-corruption programs by the international community over that 20-year period, in terms of measurable results, you can see it in certain sectors, but it's very, very difficult to prove that there's actually been very much aggregate reduction in levels of corruption. And so I'm going to explain, well, first of all, let me just run down the list of steps that different approaches that have been taken, and then my explanation for why the results are meager and what would really have to be done if you're going to affect this. So there's lots of categories of anti-corruption measures that have been done. Some of them are structural in reshaping, the nature of government. And so it's been argued if you decentralize governments, if you begin to outsource certain services rather than holding it within the government, if you undergo comprehensive civil service reform, many, for example, African bureaucracies were tremendously overstaffed because of patronage requirements, and so there was an effort to slim them down. So that's one category. Another one that was really favored by a lot of economists was actually simplification, meaning that the more government does, the more opportunities there are for bribery and rent seeking and so forth. And so if you get the government, you reduce government discretion, like customs agencies that make a lot of decisions about inspecting this container versus that container, then you would reduce the opportunities for corruption and therefore corruption itself. The most extreme case of this was Indonesia, that actually outsourced its entire customs operation to a Swiss company operating out of Singapore. So they just kept Indonesians away from that, completely. So that's another example. Another probably the main thrust over the last 10 years have been transparency and accountability measures. So the theory is very good. You know, you're not going to do anything about corruption if you don't know it's happening. So you need transparency. And then you need to hold the people that are doing bad things accountable. And that's the accountability part. And a lot of organizations have sprung up, both officially sponsored things like the Open Government Partnership or the EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, that are all supposed to produce greater transparency. There's a lot of NGOs that do this, like I Paid a Bribe, you know, in India, where if you see somebody offering a bribe, you report it on the website and so forth. And by and large, if you look at the empirical evaluations of all of that, the conclusion that I come to is that although some of them in certain sectors have worked, some of the transparency initiatives, transparency by itself really doesn't do very much. Because, you know, for example, the Russian government requires all government officials to declare their assets. And so, you know, you get these bureaucrats saying, yeah, I have, you know, assets of, you know, $7 million. I mean, there's no explanation for how they got this money. And then they're still in office. You know, nothing happens. Without an actual mechanism, a collective action mechanism, by which you can use that information to actually sanction officials that are seen to be acting corruptly, it doesn't, you know, it doesn't do very much good. Another approach have been specialized anti-corruption agencies. There's a big fight going on in Ukraine right now over the powers of NABU, their anti-corruption agency. One of the most successful, well, a couple of models. The Hong Kong one was always regarded as the gold standard, which Indonesia copied with the KPK. Some of them have been all right, but as a whole, they have tended to be quite weak and ineffective, like the one in the Philippines. And then finally, there's this whole international dimension where you get an international organization to basically either take over part of the justice system or, you know, try to enforce or promote standards. So the EITI is one of them. CICIG in Guatemala is another case where they actually forced out the past president and have now laid charges against the current president. And that's actually pretty dramatic. You know, the Guatemalan court system is very corrupt. You know, it was just felt that, again, you couldn't really solve the problem in Guatemala. You needed that kind of international help. So why overall, well, and so I would say that in the areas where there has been actually progress, a lot of people think that actually what's happened is you've simply pushed the corruption elsewhere. So there's been some progress, you know, like in customs agencies and, you know, frontline workers, service providers, but a lot of that has just been pushed upstairs, you know, to higher levels in the political system where it's much harder to see what a minister or a president or a prime minister is doing. So why is this the case? I think that there is a big misunderstanding about why corruption exists. There's a kind of view that the normal situation in political systems is sort of being like Denmark, where everybody is squeaky clean, and, you know, and that somehow a corrupt system is like a disease that for some reason a certain group of poor countries catch this disease. They don't really know what, you know, how to get healthy again. And that's actually not the case, because I think most political systems throughout most of human history have been based on some form of patrimonialism or kind of rent-seeking elites that basically what the government is an agreement or a pact among a certain set of elites to extract rents from the rest of the society. It's very stable because those elites are the ones that control violence, and so you can control violence by doing that, but it leads to their extraction of a lot of rents from the rest of the society, and they don't want to give it up. It's not a matter of being lectured by the World Bank or DFID or anybody else. They've got a really, really powerful self-interest, and you're not going to get at them unless you can generate sufficient political power in order to get them out of office and replace them by somebody else, by a bureaucratic system that operates under modern principles. And in human history, this has only been done in a couple of dozen countries. And even where it has been done, there's a lot of backsliding, you know, and I think you can see some of that in the United States today. So my bottom line is the following. It is possible to eliminate systemic corruption. I think one of the clearest cases of this was actually the United States itself in the 19th century, getting rid of the old patronage spoils system. But it takes political action. And that political action consists of basically three different things. First, you have to have grassroots support. You have to have a civil society mobilized against corruption. And that was true, in the progressive era in the United States and other places. You have to have good leadership. Again, in the progressive era, that was the case. Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, a lot of other people. And then finally, you have to have a clear idea of what the system looks like that you want to get to. And that's really the work of, more intellectuals and people that kind of think through in the context of my country, what do I actually want the government to look like? And that means, and it's also something that's very prolonged because you're forcing out an entire elite that is very self-interested and really dug in. And so it's, in the United States, that was a political struggle at the turn of the century that really lasted about 30 or 40 years. And so it's not something that's simple to do. But there's some positive signs. So I think, in Guatemala, to go back to that case, you couldn't have gotten rid of President Perez. CICIG alone was not sufficient to do it if you didn't have the mobilization of civil society there. In Brazil, it's a complicated case. People are very depressed because of the corruption of the entire elite. But you've got a judiciary that's very independent, the most independent judiciary anywhere in Latin America. And civil society has been mobilized there, because people are fed up with it. And so hopefully, more of these movements will take shape in other developing countries. And as far as I can see, that's ultimately the only way that you're really going to deal, with deeply entrenched systemic corruption. Thank you.
First, I also want to thank Steve and the Center and the Institute and the Stanley Foundation for inviting me to be here, come back to the Bay Area. I think it's also important to recognize that we're looking at a situation now as different from what we thought we would see in the aftermath of getting into the 21st century. At that time, we sort of had a sense that we were moving into an era where we were going to see greater and stronger democracies and far greater peace than the reality we're seeing, particularly, I'd say, the second decade of the 21st century. And there's the uncomfortable slippage, and I think it's important to look at this in two ways. One, I was with the crisis group for the past 15 years. And so we looked at where does this occurring? Where are we seeing breakdowns in what we thought were positive developments? First, obviously, the countries formerly in the Soviet Union. Second, those facing ideologically charged non-state armed terrorism. And in this hemisphere, and I'm going to focus a little more, very similar to what Dr. Fukuyama said, we see weak post-conflict institutions, those that are under the threat from transnational criminal organizations, and those where corrupt elites have benefited from wide impunity over generations. Now, I think that part of the reason is that we really are still trying to work to effectively empower civil society. We've only some instances, which I'll talk about, where we've successfully crossed ideological divides within democratic political party structures in order to bring about some measure of stronger rule of law. And we find it difficult to identify how do you create the political will that enables the system to begin to move on transparency and anti-corruption in a sustainable way. I think that to some degree, Dr. Fukuyama was saying, technical knowledge of what you need in terms of effective civil service rules, in terms of independent prosecutors, judiciaries, we know it. How to create the political will to bring them into effect and sustain them remains a challenge. To some degree, what the Positive Peace Index does is said this is absolutely critical, not just for itself, but for the other factors in positive peace. And I think that that's important to recognize. And I think I also want to mention, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that slippage is also occurring in the United States, and that the Positive Peace Index, the Global Peace Index, and the World Bank governance indicators show it. Or you can read the latest tweets from the White House. Your choice. Of the regions of the world, the Gallup survey that just came out on the law and order essentially found that Latin America and the Caribbean ranked the lowest worldwide. I should add, they also found that the 12% of Venezuelans feeling safe to walk alone at night and 14% who trust their police are the lowest rankings that Gallup has found since they began this survey in 2005 in any country in the world. The latest TI barometer on the region estimated that 90 million persons in 20 countries had paid bribes last year, and that 2/3 of the 22,000 people they interviewed face-to-face felt that corruption was on the increase and that police and politicians were the most corrupt. I think it is clear that public perception in the Americas that corruption is omnipresent and growing is affecting the political process. I think it will strongly influence recent elections in Argentina and Peru. It will be a significant factor in next month's elections in Honduras. And probably most of all, it will affect and probably close to determine the outcome of next year's presidential elections in Mexico. Now, in addition, what's linked to it, and this goes to the factors of how these factors link to each other, is that the perception of corruption is linked to the perception of inequality in economic terms. And the majority in the hemisphere believe that a significant reason for their limited economic situation is the corrupt advantage that some in society derive from their political and economic power. And they're corrupt. They're correct, rather, in many respects. You've heard about the situation in Brazil, and I want to talk a bit about Venezuela. But not only do you have in Brazil the impeachment of one president, the possible prosecution of the current one, although last week's vote in the Congress to halt investigations is not good, but also the prosecution of the likely next president, President Lula. But all of that pales besides what's happening in Venezuela. And here, I think the distinction between grand, petty, and political corruption is fuzzy. When you have to bribe someone to get treated in the hospital in Caracas, or when powdered milk meant for poor children is smuggled over the border by the military into Colombia to be sold, or when you have to show that you voted in a particular way in order to get the card that will make you eligible to receive food being distributed by the military, which was the case in last week's election, you know that that country is failing. You also know that the international community has not been able to come up with a response. And that brings me to Mexico and the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. You've heard a little bit about it. I would urge you to take a look at a recent study that a group called the Central American Institute for Fiscal Studies, ICEFI, published a few weeks ago. It focuses on corruption, and it traces the linkages between transnational organized crime, local gangs, and corrupt officials, particularly in the police, undermining citizen security, governance, and economic opportunity. In Honduras, Salvador, and Guatemala, they found that fraud, only in the cases which had actually come to trial, resulted in a loss of 4.3% GDP in a single year in Guatemala, in Honduras, 2.1% in El Salvador, and probably double that in Guatemala. And they looked at the one case which was called La Línea, a telephone line that went from the customs officials up to the offices of the president and vice president as to how much they could be permitted to evade customs. And in 1 year alone, that was $87 million. Now, as you've heard, and I'm not going to go into Mexico because the time is going. But even within this doom and gloom, there are bright spots. And you mentioned one of them. But even in Mexico, where there are 10 governors of 32 who are either under indictment or fled the country, the reason we know about it is because the press and human rights organizations denounced them. And even as weak as it is, the Mexican criminal justice system filed the charges and brought them to court. And last year, 630,000 Mexicans signed petitions to press the Congress, which it did, to pass a new system on an independent Attorney General's office. The bad news is that the independent anti-corruption prosecutor that was included has not yet been named because of politics. Also, I think it's very positive, and I think the linkage between stopping the corruption of the Parapolitica scandal in Colombia, where the government officials were linked to the paramilitary, actually has helped set the stage for the 5-year peace negotiations and peace agreement that has now been achieved. You heard about Sisi, but it's important to understand that Sisi was linked and strengthened two courageous women. The first, Fiscal General in Guatemala, Claudia Paz y Paz, and the current one, Thelma Aldana. And together, they've brought those cases that essentially shattered what had been absolute impunity of Los Intocables. The political and economic and criminal networks whose influence and power corrupted Guatemala for generations. And also in Salvador, civil society pushed for the naming of an independent attorney general, and he has brought cases over the last several years against former presidents and even against political parties for failing to list their contributors. The result of that in the last week, 2 weeks, was that the Supreme Court basically said, if you don't follow the law and list the contributors to your parties and the campaigns, you cannot file candidates for next year's congressional elections. And so that information is coming. Now, what we see is that there are some people in the hemisphere and some leaders who recognize that if we don't move towards low levels of corruption, governance is going to be undermined, and so will peace. As a result, at the World Economic Forum this year, Latin America and the Caribbean were the only country that identified corruption as the major threat to stability and economic progress. And next year's Summit of the Americas in March in Lima, the focus is corruption and what needs to be done about it. And I think there's no question that the core is civil society linking with political leadership. Chile and Uruguay stand out. The Positive Peace Index, the Global Peace Index, World Bank, all recognize Chile and Uruguay among the top countries in the world, including higher than Spain, Italy, and Greece in many aspects. But it's really what they've done is they've been able to create a sense within society that corruption has to be rooted out. And as a result, what they've been able to do is basically to create a situation in which the country as a whole recognizes that there needs to be maintained both accountability and transparency. And one of the things that we're going to be doing at CSIS is bringing civil society leaders from Chile and Uruguay and the government anti-corruption people to the Northern Triangle countries over the next 2 years. Essentially, not to say this is the law you need to adopt, but at least to say this is how we created the political will that went over the ideological divide between the left and the traditional right in Chile and in Uruguay in order to create the system. Don't know how well it's going to work, but vamos a ver. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for having me today. It's a real honor and privilege and pleasure to be a participant on this panel. It's wonderful speakers, and I think the setup actually, I don't know who the genius was behind the population of the panel as it was, but I think it was really well done because we've heard about interventions coming from government, we've heard about civil society, and I think it comes to me to talk about the private sector and to talk about business. I think it was Michelle that kicked us off earlier talking about progress with peace really being a whole of society challenge. I think corruption is at least as much, and poor governance is at least as much a whole of society challenge as is peace. And the business community and the private sector, I think, has a tremendous role to play. It's all good and well. I think we talk a lot about policy. We talk about the theoretical underpinnings of the fight against corruption, but I think the business world is one of the handful of places where the rubber literally meets the road, and you really have that interface between action and corruption. For far too long, I think we'd probably all agree that the best you could say about the business community vis-a-vis corruption was that they were on the sidelines as kind of observers to the governance landscape and the jurisdictions where they operate, and sort of sat on their hands and were effectively consumers of that governance environment, so to speak. And far too often, they were a principal driver of that corruption. We can think about Siemens in the late aughts. We can think about Halliburton. We can think about BAE Systems, the Panama Papers, Petrobras, Odebrecht, on and on. The litany of really bad behavior by the business community in the corruption context is very well known. Clearly, this is something that has got to change, and my view is that there are lights coming through the clouds on this. But whether there are more skeptics in this room or optimists, we'll find out. But in the first place, it really does have to change. The scale of the challenge, and as we heard from Professor Fukuyama, despite the many billions of dollars, the many years of effort, the many wonderful efforts that have gone on, broadly speaking, the needle on good governance and corruption really hasn't shifted that much. We have, certain countries and certain examples in certain sectors where things have improved a bit, but by and large, the scale of corruption, $1 trillion plus per year cost of corruption hasn't really adjusted that much. The World Bank governance indicators suggest that the governance environment hasn't, at a macro level, improved that much over these years. So the scale of the challenge has never been greater. It's never been more urgent. As we've talked about, there's really no progress to be made with poverty reduction, with peace and security, with education, with infrastructure, if we don't deal with the corruption problem. Corruption is undermining our ability to really make progress on all of those fronts. And so, in my view, the way I think of it is that it's a problem that is effectively on the scale of climate change and has the urgency that the refugee crisis has, and we really need to deal with that. Coming to the business community, it's one, as I said, is really too often at best been kind of on the sidelines of this conversation, and really hasn't been sufficiently called upon by the world community, by the citizenry, by the global community to really take up the cause of fighting corruption, and this really has to change. And I think there are ways to go about it, and there are reasons for doing so. First of all, business has a really strong incentive to improving the governance landscape. We often, when we think about this issue, we think about the one bad actor in a bribe transaction, and they're obviously a beneficiary of that corrupt act. But by and large, business wants stability, it wants consistency, and benefits from stronger institutions, rule of law, a clean business environment, positive peace, and those sorts of stabilities. I think about, as just an example to illustrate the point, imagine being Tesla and needing to think about where they're going to source their cobalt to build their electric batteries, and understanding that something like 70 to 80% of the world's cobalt resources are in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The difficulty of doing business in that environment for a company like Tesla is huge, and they have a tremendous incentive, I think, to really try to use their influence, the influence that they have, which is not insignificant, to improve the governance landscape and the corruption landscape there. So they have the incentive. They also have the capacity and the influence to impact at scale. not to say that they're going to solve every challenge, not to say that there aren't going to be completely intractable, impervious environments where the work of business is not going to really be able to make a difference, but there are clearly places where their influence can come to bear and can have impact. And I look at other examples in the human rights space, what business has been able to do and achieve over the last even just 5 to 10 years around the business and human rights context. Looking at what they've been able to do in supply chains globally. Look at what business has been able to do on the sustainability agenda. And look at what business is starting to do. I wasn't going to bring up the White House and our president, but around climate change in the post-Paris environment for the United States. So there are examples where business has been able to bring or is bringing its capacity and influence to really advance progress on many of these agendas. So what concretely, and for me this is where it really gets important, and I appreciate Professor Fukuyama's challenge and to talk about specifics and concrete things. My view is that we really have to. It's very important to talk about data and measurement and indices, and those are critical. But we also have to take the conversation another step or two forward to really talk about what specific interventions can be taken by civil society, by government, by the business community to try to advance progress on these things. First, for business, it's a little bit stating the obvious, but they've got to get their own governance house in order. Don't pay bribes, just don't do it. That is one thing that you as a business can start with in terms of getting your governance act together. Do everything that you can to make sure that no one in your organization or up and down your supply chain is paying bribes. There are very specific things that we know about how to do this, and we talked about leadership at the government level, leadership at the CEO level. There are a lot of things that businesses can do to really shape the environment and the culture up and down the organization. Don't engage in hyper-aggressive tax strategies, and educate your shareholders about why you're doing that. For a lot of businesses, obviously, in the U.S., having fiduciary duties of utmost importance to your shareholders often leads businesses to engage in approaches to taxation that might maximize profits, but don't lead to positive social and economic outcomes in the countries where they operate. So that is a process, obviously, of educating shareholders about those issues, but that is a way to have really direct impact and make sure that dollars actually stay in jurisdictions where they belong and can do good work. Take affirmative steps to foster a culture of long-termism in companies. Assure you that you are including in your regulatory filings information on the broader sustainability issues, including governance and corruption. Going to the point about transparency, transparency alone, yes, is not enough, but you do need to make the information available that civil society and others can sort of pick up and run with, and journalists, and do something with that information, and including good information on your behaviors in these areas is key. Externally, use your influence wherever you have it, with governments, local business communities, suppliers, to support good governance, rule of law, strong institutions, strong regulatory frameworks. Undertake collective action efforts with like-minded market participants to join together and engage in a set of behaviors that you are going to engage in, a set of behaviors you're not going to engage in when it comes to working in certain contexts. And then seek out ways to proliferate your own good practices and raise standards so that the good practices of the 1% of businesses that are sort of on the front foot on some of these issues begin to kind of percolate out to the 99% else that's out there. So I don't mean to present a naive view, but I do think if we're going to really make progress on this issue in particular, on the positive piece broadly, on the Sustainable Development Goals, even broader still, we've got to get governance out of the business out of the mindset of being part of the problem and to being something part of the solution. And so I look forward to talking more with all of you on those bases. Thanks.
Thank you, Ulysses. This, I think, really rounds up the way at least Michelle had conceived a lot of the program, of being able to move from like research where, this is the kind of things we do in a place like this, to policy, into practice. And I think you're shedding light on a very different way even to think about corporate social responsibility when we think about what firms do in those kinds of statements of how they will do good in the world. So let's open up to discussion, questions. I see a lot of hands. Okay, so I'm going to start from this side and just run through. So on that side, please. Yeah, on the back. Yeah, you. And if you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Margarita Kiwis. I co-direct the Peace Innovation Lab. This was a really fascinating conversation for me. And for the next iteration of this conference, I'd like to see what the role of technology is going to be around governance. There was certainly a movement in the early 2000s about e-government and how that was going to reduce corruption. Where does that stand as we get into machine learning and AI, and that begins to be part of our sphere? What is the impact going to be on governance? I'm very curious about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadezhda Marquez. I'm a researcher on gender inclusion in Silicon Valley, and my question is for Professor Francis Fukuyama. What is our hope, or what does history teaches us when corruption is not only in the legislative but also in the judiciary? You mentioned that Brazil has a very independent judiciary, but it's also corrupt. And just to give you an example, we have the president of the Supreme Court, Gilmar Mendes, who's been accused of several corruption cases himself.
Hello, my name's Tim Gavin from the Rotary Club of Fremont, and I was CPA and also an attorney. My first project assignment when I graduated from undergraduate was to go to Europe and do audits under the newly enacted Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And I went into 2 sales offices, and the first question was, do you bribe government officials? And this fellow whose base salary was $3 million US said, absolutely, how do you think we get all this business? Then we went to the next city, asked the same question with the same result. And it turned out that the Fortune 500 companies had all gotten together and decided, how are we going to deal with this 1976 law? Well, there were no penalties associated with that law. So in the sense of trying to promote jobs in the US, our government was really complicit in the corruption of other foreign governments. Your comments?
So on the technology front, yeah, there's a lot of things that can be done, like in e-procurement. In fact, we've got at my center at Stanford this year a fellow that worked on Prozoro, which was a Ukrainian open source project to put all of their public procurement on a very transparent e-procurement system, and it's worked very well. So the Defense Ministry now can't buy a tank, without everybody seeing what the bids are and all the specifications and that sort of thing. So I think that helps. I think, however, as we've seen, technology is a dialectical process in which the good guys and the bad guys, keep fighting, and it swings one way at a certain moment and the other way at another. And putting everything online opens up, lots of room for hackers and, bad actors as well in ways that we are not witnessing. On the question of Brazil, so yeah, there is corruption in the Brazilian judiciary, but it's all relative. It's relative to other judiciaries in other countries in Latin America, in other, countries that are similarly situated. And I would say that there's still an independence in that judiciary that is very important and, has led to some very serious prosecutions. What's the solution? Well, in extreme circumstances, countries have actually sought to cut out the judiciary altogether. So one of the issues, the KPK in Indonesia, their anti-corruption commission, in order for them to operate, because the Indonesian judiciary was itself so corrupt, they basically created a parallel judiciary to try anti-corruption cases. That's the big issue. In fact, there were demonstrations in the streets of Kiev last week because the protesters wanted Ukraine to carve out a separate anti-corruption judiciary because you couldn't trust the regular court system. So, I think this is a sort of institutional innovation that countries are driven to when they've got, deeply entrenched, corruption in their existing institutions.
A couple of things. I'll start with the last. Not so much about Brazil alone, but the issue of corruption in the judiciary is absolutely critical. It's what, right now, for example, I mean, in Guatemala, one of the things CC did was bring a case, which is apparently successful, in prosecuting a member of the Supreme Court. In El Salvador, similarly, another member of the Supreme Court is under prosecution. Again, it goes back to why and how. And it wasn't just that the prosecutors were successful. It was that civil society raised sufficient demands so that the prosecutors then did what they could, and in this case, prosecuted 2 specific judges. The question is going to be, in many of the countries, how do you set up a process where all of your political forces are engaged in assuring, looking down the future, ensuring that you have independent and relatively honest judges selected. Particularly, that's going to be a question next year for the Constitutional Court in El Salvador and the following year in Guatemala. And I suspect that that issue is going to be framed at the Summit of the Americas coming up next year. The one other thing that I would say is I don't think you could get the same answer from the companies today about their paying bribes, because I think many of them in the last 10 years have found that they will be prosecuted. Not enough, but some.
Yeah, just a couple quick things, because I think most of the questions have been pretty well answered. I think on the technology point, I think, you know, maybe we can regroup in a year and talk about that. I think it's going to be a little bit of a longer time horizon. I think, you know, there are a lot of initiatives that are just getting up and running, but the impact of technology beyond e-governance and some of the things you talked about is, I think, incredibly exciting and transformative. And I think of even just basic, very simple things, the significance of kind of the Twitter world that we live in now, and how that affects the behavior of businesses and governments, I think. Not always, obviously, in a benign way or for the good, but it has become increasingly hard, I think, to do business in a kind of, you know, behind closed doors, backroom sort of way, when, you know, the share value of your company could be decimated with a single tweet that comes flying across the ether, whether it's from the Niger Delta or from the boardroom in Tokyo or whatever. I think we are entering, we have been on this path for a while, but increasingly a world of hyper-transparency where, you know, information is so ubiquitous, and I think there just really aren't that many sort of dark corners to engage in bad behavior anymore. And I think so it's in businesses' interest, I think, to start behaving well for that reason as well. And just to say, I think on the point on the FCPA and the penalties, I tend to agree as well. I think companies that are subject to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and those are companies that either sort of exist in the U.S., have presence in the U.S., or list shares on a U.S. Stock exchange, have really, I think, gotten the message and upped their game. And it's not to say that there aren't a lot of bad things still happening, but I think it has been a tremendous wake-up call. And I think, you know, we're on a sort of trajectory where, you know, businesses are really trying to catch up with them, and a lot of them have. I mean, a lot of the big multinationals have caught up with the expectations of the U.S. government around these sorts of issues. There's maybe some of you have heard of it, just going to the point I think that you made about businesses early on complaining about the being hamstrung by the FCPA, that there were a lot of complaints early on by U.S. businesses that the FCPA was going to limit their ability to do business because their, you know, European competitors or whatever could go and pay all the bribes that they needed to do to get business done. There's a story about early on, I think, in the Trump administration, Trump having a conversation with Rex Tillerson saying, you know, we got to do something about the FCPA here. It's really hindering U.S. companies' ability to successfully do business around the world. And Tillerson said to Trump, no, Mr. President, and I think this is one of the few times he has actually said straight up, no, Mr. President. And he told the story about, I think it was ExxonMobil trying to enter or do a deal in Yemen, I think, or somewhere sort of in the Gulf. And the story was essentially that when he was trying to negotiate this deal, one of the Yemeni government officials, basically told him that if he wanted to get this deal done, he was going to have to wire $20 million or something to his account. Tillerson refused to do that and said, nope, Exxon does not do business that way. And they didn't get that deal done that day, but a year later, they were actually ultimately able to sign the deal. And so I think the point there is, it's not about all business being able to have influence in every place, but when you're in Exxon, and that's its example, and you have real influence, understand what your influence is and exercise it. You may not be able to do that in a different country, in a different company, may not be able to do the same thing in Yemen, but where you have that ability to really to shape things, it's incumbent that you do. So, thanks.
Lothar from the German Technical Cooperation, GIZ. We work on more than 30 countries on the EITI, and I would like to make two comments. I think what the colleague said on hyper transparency, I would agree with that. I think there's a lot of information out there, and from a practical point of view, I feel we need to have intermediaries who can interpret that, who can help that, and actually also for civil society. We have a lot of information on changing the use of soil, extractive industries, and our focus now in EITI, for example, is the subnational level. Is actually having reporters, having journalists, having community leaders understand what is out there, because there is a lot out there. And the other one on transparency and anti-corruption, I think it really depends on the sector. I think in procurement it's tremendously important. In infrastructure, I work in Mexico with the Mexican government, and unfortunately after these two earthquakes, now they have a campaign actually very much spearheaded by the private sector, Corruption Kills, and they show images of buildings, new buildings that collapsed. So in a sense, I think they do build up that momentum, but you need not only the typical opinion leaders, but you really need people who really translate a lot of information that's out there into proposals. What does that really mean? And I think that hasn't been addressed so far.
Indonesia has been invoked several times, and I was interested, Mark, in your comment that the last 10 years was a great deal of improvement. Well, over 10 years ago, I spent 3 weeks in Indonesia at the University of Indonesia teaching a course in business ethics. At that time, when I would tell people, it would invoke a great deal of humor that I was doing that. And I interviewed expat companies that were doing business in Indonesia. The very frequent comment was, anything is possible for a price. And a story was told to me that was, I'll assume was apocryphal, but was supposed to be exemplary. The colonel who's in charge of procurement receives a kickback from the firm, that is the vendor. It's explained to me that's not the ethical issue. The ethical issue is, how does he distribute the proceeds above him and below him? Because the expectation is that there will be a distribution in order to enhance salaries of very lowly paid people. And by like token, if he has the opportunity, he will have jobs for family members. Because if you're in a position of power, the expectation is that you will protect the family by giving them jobs. The question that I have with regard to this, I mean, this is a mixture of economic considerations and cultural norms. How do you deal with that one, or this interpenetrating duo when it comes to corruption?
I want to pick up on some of the comments Mark made about the democracy, and we thought the ascendancy of it in the 21st century, and the rise of the different models, particularly the Chinese model, and where corruption's endemic to the way you do international business, and that for many countries up to the beginning of the 21st century, they believed they had to take the Western democratic model they were ever going to develop. And that perception in many, many countries in Africa and Asia has changed.
I think just a couple things I think that I have to address in the points. You know, the point around the need for intermediaries to interpret, you know, all of this information, I think is really key, and I think that's, you know, where civil society and, you know, others, you know, really need to kind of step in and step up the game, and I think that, you know, there are certainly examples of that. I think about places like Nigeria, where you know, there is a lot of information that's been recently extracted through EITI, the Nigerian EITI, and the work that you know, certain journalists have done to take that up with some pretty amazing programming and support that I know that DFID has done. But that is obviously very clearly a key part of the theory of change and that sort of value chain. And I think if we don't, you know, also really do full justice to that segment, then you're right. And I think that goes to the point about transparency by itself just isn't enough. But I do think what we're looking at is you know, systems change that we've been talking about a little bit off and on today, that there's so much that I think it's really hard for us to even start to get our heads around what that environment's going to look like in 10 or 15 years as a result of the hyper-transparency and you know, the people that will step in and sort of take up that information and do really impactful things with it. And I appreciate, you know, you mentioning the Corruption Kills campaign. It wasn't something I was aware of, but it sounds very interesting and very exciting. So I think I'll stop there.
I think one of the lessons in terms of transparency and the information, the point you made about needing to train civil society, particularly in how to use it, one of the avenues that's being pursued is to, in fact, create a network of transparency civil society organizations in which that training then takes place within the civil society world, and they share their own lessons learned. And that's sort of the reason that we're bringing the Chilean and Uruguayan civil society to Central America to talk about how you manage it. And I think that that's very important. The only other comment that I wanted to make was in relation to the point that you made, Steve. There's no question that China is pushing a different model. It's not clear to me that that's a sustainable lesson in those countries that's going to be adopted, because there's a lot that comes with it. And particularly in Africa, their vision of how China uses its aid and how it takes over the economy locally has not been very applauded. The only other thing, though, is it does seem to me that we need to think about how to create and communicate a vision of the linkage between low levels of corruption, peace, more equitable distribution of resources as a whole.
So I can combine answers to a couple of the different questions. So on the question of cultural norms, I think that people misunderstand what those are in a certain way, because in many cases, taking a bribe is not a reflection of a deeply held cultural value that you bribe everybody. I mean, there's actually very few countries in which that's really acceptable. The problem is that when you have deeply penetrated corruption, even if you don't want to be corrupt yourself, you don't have a choice. You know, in Latin America, you've got this saying, "Plata o plomo," right? Either a bullet, money, or a bullet. And if you're in a police force and you don't take the bribe, you could get killed, or your family could get killed. And so it's really not a choice. It's not a moral choice for you. The incentives are really stacked the wrong way. And it's basically what economists would call a collective action problem, that everybody in the system may realize that if they were at a different equilibrium where everybody was following the rules, everyone would be better off. but no individual can be the first mover in that kind of system. And that then suggests that all these bottom-up efforts, so the civil society is really critical, but there are, some of these collective action problems really have to be solved in a more top-down way. I mean, there has to be overt, coordination of the way people are going to operate. And that actually was a question I had for Ulysses, when you were saying that, corporations should stop trying to avoid, tax, taking advantage of tax, rules. And I wonder actually whether that can be done without actually more formal forms of, collective action. Because again, if you're Apple and, it's up to you whether you legally take advantage of lax, tax enforcement in different jurisdictions, why should you be the first? Because your competitors will, take advantage of that, you'll be in a worse position, so on and so forth. And so it does seem to me that those are all cases where you actually need a coordinating mechanism, which may be a government, it may be an international organization, so forth.
Yeah, please go ahead.
No, I think it's a point well taken, and one thing just as something that I'm recently launching as a plug for a project that I'm engaged in right now is with the UN Global Compact and trying to help them conceive and create and then launch an action platform on business and sort of goal SDG 16 issues broadly defined. And in a very simple way, what this platform will do is to try to identify very serious, rigorous, kind of business-minded answers to the question, what can business do to advance progress with, good governance, anti-corruption, rule of law. And I think it's very likely that an area that we will work on, and I am a lawyer, but I'm not a tax lawyer, but it seems like what we're hearing from a lot of the businesses that we're speaking with, we've had about 10 or so interviews right now, is that that's a real priority because exactly, it's a collective action problem. They all, I think, recognize that it's something that they want to take on, but they really need guidance on how to do it and to do it in a coordinated way. Even to some very, something that I mentioned earlier, the basic issue of corporations having the prime fiduciary duty to the shareholders to maximize profits for the shareholders. There's a tension there, obviously, between maybe not taking the most aggressive sort of approach to tax and minimizing your tax burden, and not maximizing the profits for your shareholders. So it's a collective action problem even at that sort of very fundamental level about what is the purpose of a corporation and what should it really be prioritizing in terms of what it's doing, but then also, how can it, as a group, I think, a business community as a group, take on this issue and take a step together as opposed to, trying to pick, having being one outlier doing it on their own. So.
Okay. I want to cut the panel right now and thank our panelists, but I do want to use my prerogative as chair to answer one question that was not completely answered, I think, which is, there is a very nice literature now in political science being developed about the networks of corruption within governments. So I think the best work actually is being done in Berkeley by Jennifer Bussell, which is a really sophisticated study of how different sectors in India have different structures of corruption within the bureaucracy. So the police works in one way, the construction kind of sector works a different way. And I think that's kind of a very promising area of research that is going on, right now. Paul Lagunes also at Columbia has this incredible work on, well, he did a famous paper on forbidden left turns about cultural norms, but then he has this work on inspectors, and it turns out that inspectors for construction, it doesn't matter so much what the size of the bribe. The typical economic theories don't matter too much. It's a lot about the leadership of the supervisors and the kind of examples that are set by supervisors that really change their behavior. So there's incredible work that shows that a lot of public servants actually can do better. But I want to thank our panelists. I know people might be hungry, and thank you so much. We'll continue.